Our next dynamic speaker has served as the global head of Azure SRE at Microsoft's Dublin office. He has worked in the internet infrastructure since the mid 1990s when he co founded the University College Dublin Internet Society. Prior to Microsoft, he was responsible for leading the Advanced Reliability Engineering team in Google at the Dublin office. He has authored various publications such as The History of the Irish Internet, the award-winning book called the SRE Book, and its next volume, the Site Reliability Workbook. Now, education is something that is very close to his heart, and hence he has contributed to lobbying for computer science as a leaving certificate subject and lectured at UCD in advanced software engineering. Now, with respect to SRE, when I say men are from dev and women are from ops, what comes to your mind? Let's try to get some crystal clear thoughts on this mind-boggling subject, and for that, let's call upon our guest of honor, Mr. Niall Murphy.
Hi everyone, my name is Niall Murphy. I am a SRE consultant working under the name of Reliability, and my session is called Men Are From Dev and Women Are From Ops, which is a imitation of the title Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, which has been prompted by some discussions in the SRE and DevOps space about the role of operations, the role of dev, social roles, and thinking in binaries, all of which I think are important topics for folks who think in binary every day. So the first thing to say is that I've had significant input from many people on this presentation, but in particular, Yvonne Lamb, who I want to specifically thank for her input on this. Now, I began by saying we're computer people. We think in binaries, so we often like to partition problem spaces. This bit of the problem space is like this set of things, this other bit of the problem space is like this other set of things, and they're not the same. Like we like hard partitions. And so when we reach around looking for analogies or looking for places where we apply this kind of thinking, I think this kind of thinking is applied in the DevOps space, in the SRE space, in the overlap between engineering and operations. And so when I'm thinking about how dev and ops are characterized, I mean, obviously not everywhere, not in the same way, and there is genuinely a diversity of assessment and opinion about this, but there's also some stereotypes. And those stereotypes, I think, are as follows: that in dev, we have folks who own the product. They're creating things, they're pushing forward, they're driving stuff in the kind of cultural background where I grew up. We would say, quotes, thrusting young man, end quotes, meaning somebody who's kind of pushing something forward. Obviously, dev is important, can't be ignored. Like you actually can't do that and continue to exist successfully as a business in an ongoing way. And in some sense, I think the stereotype as well is that success of the company, of the business, because obviously a lot of us would work in companies or institutions where the success of the software is kind of a one-to-one mapping to the success of the business. Success is felt to rest almost entirely within the sphere of dev. And now, coming back to this thinking in binaries analogy, ops, on the other hand, is a pretty different situation, right? In some sense, ops owns failure. When things don't go wrong, or sorry, when things go wrong, they go wrong in production. Almost by definition, if they go wrong earlier in the development process, that's not a, quotes, real problem. So failure in actuality is owned by ops. And in many cases, ops has to accept things. Like there's a lot that ops is unable to control, particularly about the behavior of users, sometimes about the behavior of the software or the systems that they're working with. And so ops is kind of in a inferior position in some sense. You could also argue, possibly strongly, possibly weakly, that ops is viewed certainly by certain kinds of leadership or in certain kinds of stereotype. Ops is irrelevant, except when terrible things are happening, at which point it becomes incredibly crucial. And then its job, ops' job is to make itself irrelevant again as quickly as possible. It's kind of an interesting state diagram. And coming back to this idea of owning failure, failure rests almost entirely here, in contrast to failure in or success in the dev context. I think that's a little subtler than the idea of failure happening in production, because obviously production can fail, but product direction can fail. And it can be seen or it can be understood that the product can be going in the wrong direction, cannot resonate with the customer base, and therefore the company can fail. So failure doesn't completely reside in ops, but failure and the idea of failure, and when people encounter failure most sharply and most immediately, is in the domain of ops. The kind of failures that you get when you do your product management incorrectly are long-term failures. Typically, it's hard to connect direct behavior. So I say we're computer people, we think in binaries. There's also an argument that we're people, we think in binaries. I mean, there's obviously a great diversity of cognitive approaches, but we do have this tendency to partition the problem space. And just like we have been talking about development and operations being binaries, opposed binaries, there are other things which are also, in some sense, stereotypically understood as opposed binaries, such as men and women. Now, I think incorrectly, but I do think that stereotype exists for sure. And we also have this parity or relationship, binary opposed relationship between working and non-working and functional and broken. And it's interesting the extent, at least I find, when I think about these concepts, interesting the extent to which they do overlap with conventional understanding of gender roles. And in particular, the pairing of men and women with development and operations is, I think, particularly interesting when you think about the following assertion, that operations is women's work. Well, why do I say that? Well, when I think about what happens in operations, the work is, typically speaking, undervalued. Keeping something going is seen as a fundamentally different situation and a different activity than developing something to do something new. So keeping something going is undervalued. It's also underpaid. Strictly speaking, operations folks who, for example, don't have a strong software background are, I believe, unable to be rewarded appropriately in the marketplace, because there's a strong financial rewards associated with, in particular, software expertise. Also, maybe to a lesser extent, systems expertise. It kind of depends a little bit on the market that you're in and the particular situation of the company, of course. But in general, I would say operations is underpaid. The work is also demanding, particularly in the operations space, where often there's some on-call obligation, or the classic story of being paged out of bed at 3 a.m. in order to fix something. Very, very demanding. Which also is associated, we should say in particular, with the act of caregiving, particularly for young children, which is stereotypically associated with women in our societies. Operations is also invisible. The work that's done, as I was saying earlier, becomes incredibly important when it's necessary and immediate and urgent, and then fades back into the background. that work being invisible makes it difficult for it to be assessed correctly, or for the value to be assessed correctly, which probably plays into the undervalued piece and underpaid piece that I was talking about earlier. Obviously difficult. I mean, I don't even think I need to really justify that one. I will say that it contains much in the way of ignored wisdom. I mean, I'm speaking to a bunch of folks from the DevOps community, so hopefully I don't have to explain in too much detail that we believe strongly that there is that aspects of behavior of software in production are very valuable, contains much valuable wisdom that could be put into the design phase of the next version of the software, integrated, rolled out, and so on. There should be a feedback loop, and this is one of the primary lessons of DevOps. There should be a feedback loop which allows us to continually improve what's going on and do so safely, right? But that doesn't apply everywhere, and so I feel pretty comfortable saying that operations in general contains much in the way of ignored wisdom, which is also a stereotype for the situation of women in our societies. And finally, I mean, flowing on from all of those assertions, I suppose, is another one, which is that I would say that operations is regarded incorrectly by people who don't do it as it's just something that anyone can do. You don't need particularly strong skills. You're just sitting there watching some dashboards, and every so often some graph goes below some critical threshold, and you press a button and the graph goes back up again and everything's happy. Like it's seen as a kind of a low skill activity. And I also think that women's work traditionally and societally speaking as well is regarded incorrectly by people who don't do it as having no value. I think it's interesting to think about why this might be the case, because I have been taken by the really strong binding between these two binaries that we use in our day-to-day lives, development, operations, men and women, and so on. And the answer I currently use, maybe I'll change it at some point, but the answer I'm currently happy with is that actually both of these kinds of activities are infrastructure. And infrastructure, as opposed to product, is a particularly prone to being ignored and invisible kind of activity or placement, because it's supporting behavior. It's supposed to work. It is assumed to be true. It is, and I mean, folks who have been in infrastructure will understand that the placement of infrastructure in companies is typically a pretty difficult one, right? Because you are getting ignored and feeling invisible and so on and so forth from almost everyone in the organization that you work with, and often from the users as well, except when it doesn't work, at which point you become incredibly visible. But I think this relates to this strong dichotomy between, that I was talking about earlier, between keeping things going and doing something new. And in developmental circles, my understanding is that product and feature creation is seen to drive revenue and be, in some sense, the fundamental support for the business. But the fundamental support for the business is fundamentally supported in turn by infrastructure, which is not regarded as quite as valuable. Now, I mean, there are obviously different views in different companies, in different situations, and so on. But I think from an infrastructural product management point of view, you're regarded as enabling other behavior, which is profitable, rather than vitally supporting the operation of the whole company. I think I mean, that view could be challenged in a number of ways. The one I like is that there's a study by Microsoft which shows that when product managers and I suppose product developers are actually developing features and launching features and so on, only 1/3 of the features which are launched on average are actually profitable in any way. And 1/3 of them actively lose money in the sense of consuming resources or having consumed developmental or machine resources. And about 1/3 of them are neutral. Now, if we take that study, and if that study is true, that should prompt us to go, oh, actually, like, there's two potential reasons why that is the case. The first one is maybe we're just not that good at guessing what's going to work in the real world, which I think has a. If you look at how good we are at other estimation tasks in software, that might not be too difficult to believe. But the other potential reason we could have to come to understand why we're so bad at figuring out what's going on in software is that just that the task itself is kind of inherently hard, and that the art of guessing what's going to contribute successfully in a dynamic environment is again not easy. But to me, that suggests that instead of having a picture of the world which is strongly informed by binary thinking, infrastructure bad, a cost, only supports things and keeps going, doesn't generate real money, product good, generates real money, is where the action is, etc. We think about that dichotomy and the fact that actually we're really, really bad at figuring out what actually does generate money, then maybe that might cause us to reflect on the accuracy of our model, which says that infrastructure isn't actually worth all that much. But I think there's one particular example which is relevant in this case, and that is the idea of technical debt. So coming back to this idea of binary thinking and people and how people think and so on, the title of this slide asserts we're people, we think in metaphors. We don't just think in binaries, we think in metaphors. And so in this context, let's talk about technical debt. And technical debt is, if I recall correctly, a phrase originally coined by, I think, Ward Cunningham, who invented wikis as well as a bunch of other stuff. And he coined that term, which is a great word to use for debt, I suppose. He coined that term when he's trying to explain to his stakeholders, non-technical stakeholders at some startup he's at, why you need to spend time, money, energy on refactoring, as in doing something which doesn't immediately create value, doing something which doesn't immediately potentially get money in the door, etc. And it's interesting because that technical debt metaphor, when we think about the concept of technical debt, not just that concept, but I mean the actual reality kind of underlying it. Technical debt as a metaphor is incredibly widely spread in our industry. In fact, when I think about, when I reflect on whether or not there's any other way to talk about it, the other metaphors or the other language that I find myself reaching for is actually technical debt style language again. It's really strongly dominant as a phrase for talking about things which should be done to the software which don't immediately get money, but which are going to cause problems at some stage, or are possibly already causing problems right now, but not existential problems. And obviously that's a long paragraph, which can be squished down to 2 words. So, it's good that we've found a kind of a summary term. But actually, debt maybe isn't the right metaphor for this. And I credit Yvonne Lamb for really starting this train of thought in me with her tweet there, saying that my theory of tech debt is that housework is the correct metaphor for the thing we call tech debt, but we can't use it. And the reason we can't use it is because of this binary social role thinking, which is very strongly distributed throughout the industry, where tech is made up of people who don't do housework or manage housework being done. I mean, this is a tweet. It obviously compresses some stuff. There are many people who work in the industry who do housework, but I do think it is interesting the extent to which actually technical debt maybe isn't the right metaphor. So a couple of reasons why I think that. First one, I mean, if we look at the attributes of debt, it's not as if this metaphor is entirely inappropriate. And I mean, I think in some sense, the central feature of debt, which is that it accumulates indefinitely and that not tackling it causes it to grow, captures something essential about the features or the factors underlying technical debt, which is useful to capture. I will 100% give us that. But if you think about the rest of the features of debt, actually, they're not quite so good, or they don't capture, as a model, they don't capture as many relevant behaviors. Many other attributes of debt include, for example, there is an innumerable and definite set of people to whom the debt is owed. Like, that's not a clear correspondence. That doesn't have a clear correspondence in the software world, I think. Also, debt can be sold on, it can be packaged, it can be instrumented, it can be used to achieve things, particularly in our widely financialized society. But none of that's actually appropriate in the software world, I think. I can't package up the fact that I haven't transitioned to the new version of the API and sell that to somebody. Like, I'm not even sure what that would mean. Another feature is it is possible to live debt-free, or at least all of the advertisements on my web browsing tell me this every so often. Possible to live debt-free, or it's something which you can completely pay off, like people clear their mortgages and so on and so forth. I am not aware of a code base where the technical debt has been paid off in its entirety, or you're living kind of technically debt-free. That seems to me to like incorrectly represent what it means to run a sufficiently large code base. And I suppose also there's detail to underlying types of debt, like payment schedule and so on and so forth. But they're kind of mostly ignored. Whereas I think for technical debt, yes, obviously we perhaps don't represent it correctly when we're thinking about it, or there's underlying types. But in the debt world, a lot of these are mostly ignored. I think attributes of housework, oh, sorry, the thing has fallen off the end there, but I'll crack on anyway. Attributes of housework really, I think, more effectively capture the underlying situation that's going on. In parallel with, or in alignment with the debt analogy, housework accumulates indefinitely, and not tackling it causes it to grow. As anyone who has ever skipped laundry or hoovering or whatever will know, things just get worse until you do something about it. And, you know, buying new pots and pans rather than cleaning them does not, in actual fact, make the situation better. Somebody has to do it, and kind of very few people enjoy it, would be another feature of housework, which I think aligns with technical debt. I do agree, and actually I'm kind of one of them. I'm one of the people who likes tidying up the details in the code base, which I suppose is the smallest level reflection of technical debt. But of course, the technical debt can stretch up to very kind of large architectural features, even entire language kind of switches and so on and so forth. So there is some internal detail. There are kinds of debt that people like, or technical debt that people like to tackle more than others. But broadly speaking, in housework and technical debt, I'll say someone has to do it, and more or less few enough people enjoy it. Another feature of housework, which I think is possibly more relevant, is that if it doesn't get done, the people who can tolerate that impact the least will end up kind of doing it, will end up volunteering for it, because actually we've just let this slide for so long, it really has to be tackled now. But this thing, whatever it is kind of narrowly scoped to sub area X. And so the people in sub area X kind of step forward to do it. Often, I mean, I won't say all of the time, but often I see people with production responsibilities stepping forward to do that kind of work, which lingers in the code base for a long while. And again, some of this is subtle and can be split on kind of development and operations lines, or maybe if you have more of a DevOps style approach, and folks who feel the pain in operations are in a position to fix it or folks who feel the pain in production are in a position to fix the code base, then that situation pertains, and maybe sometimes you're blocked from fixing it, but I do think that happens. I think very clearly from a housework point of view, it's just essentially the cost of having a kitchen is housework. You have to do the dishes before you eat your next meal. There is a really strong binding between the set of things that you have in front of you and the tasks that you need to achieve, and kind of distorting stuff artificially so that you don't do that work is just a weird way of behaving, really. And so I think the advantages of the housework metaphor are really considerable. Like, it hides less detail than the debt metaphor. In particular, all of this stuff about using debt to achieve stuff, which is possible in the financialization world. Well, actually, you can't use housework to achieve anything other than doing the stuff you should do, like achieving the tasks, making stuff work like it should. And another advantage is that housework is kind of intuitively understood as having several different underlying types, laundry, hoovering, etc. And there's different interest groups potentially affected. And also there's a very clear difference between different severities of housework problem, like the running out of toilet paper problem is a very serious problem compared to the undusted for one more day problem. And I don't think that the technical debt metaphor allows us to capture those differences as usefully as this metaphor does. I think regarding housework as a pure externality has consequences in a way, particularly in the context of this metaphor, that the debt metaphor doesn't. So overall, I would say the takeaways from this journey I've been on is that, I mean, as we know in other contexts, binary thinking isn't necessarily that helpful in many cases. So it's useful to expose this internal detail and come to understand things as a spectrum rather than these binaries. As is so often the case, and particularly true, I think, day to day for people who are in DevOps implementations, etc., we're trapped by our accustomed thinking. We're trapped by these binaries. We come to view things or come to model things in this way, in the way that we're accustomed to, and actually we don't need to be. And sometimes great things can come as a result of breaking those and moving forward. And I think the final point is that everything has a cost, but not everything is a debt. Not everything is owed. Not everything is deferrable. Not everything necessarily accumulates quite in that way. So everything is a cost, but not everything is a debt. And perhaps we should change our metaphors. Thank you very much.